Okay, for those of you who are here for the first time, I'll do the very fast overview. This quarter we're talking about the church as family. And we're saying, okay, so there are certain things that it looks like and that it means to be family. This is the way that we behave in our family. This is the stuff that we do in our family. And we're taking those principles and we're applying them to the church. And so the church as family, that's what we're doing. We've talked about things like the family needs to be unified. That's at the top of the list. There is cooperation within the family. We work together to do the things that we need to do. We've talked about loyalty within the family. We stand with each other and for each other. On that one, I always think, that one was probably one of the hardest classes I taught and prepared. But that one means a lot to me, the loyalty factor. That's when you find out, that's one of those where the rubber meets the road, where you find things out. And so we talked about families share their stuff. Mom goes to the groceries and buys the groceries with a collective pool of money that the family shares and puts the groceries in the pantry, and then the family shares the groceries. We share our stuff. That's what families do. All of these things. In our last class, we talked about how one of the things that families do is they suffer together. And that is one of those where it's like, okay, everything up to this point is nice. I'm not saying it's not necessary. It is necessary. Otherwise, we wouldn't have talked about it. But it's nice. It's enjoyable when we're unified and when we work together and when we share when we need to share and all of those things. But when suffering happens, that's game day. Now it's time to be the family and step up. You can't drop that ball. And so I thought last class was a really good class of sharing and examples of here's what we do. And so I hope that you paid attention in that class and that you're ready to go now whenever it comes time. Is there anything you want to say about suffering, anything by way of this whole class? Like, now is the time to have your big thoughts up to this point. Is there anything that has come into your mind that you want to share before we start with today's stuff? I'm kind of hoping that somebody has something to say so that we don't have to do today's stuff. Maybe we could start a whole different rabbit chasing conversation, and I'm not looking forward to today's class.
One of the things that continues to come up in my mind is that we don't fall in love with the parents or parent in the situation chooses to love despite whatever the circumstances are. The person chooses to love the child despite their belligerence, despite their rebelliousness. They choose to not be determined, as the scripture says, to put their child to death, as if to just throw their hands up and say, forget it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Then that osmosisly goes to the rest, and hopefully that example
Yeah.
choosing to love.
Right.
Cognitive choice today.
Yeah. Remember we did a class on data, families, love, and then one class on examples of love turned into two classes of examples to love. And I think one of our main takeaways was love is not a feeling, love is an action. It's something that we do and a choice that we make, as you say. Good. Others? All right, well, I guess we have to do it now. So I really did cut this class out when I was putting the agenda together. And I have plenty of other material, and I replaced this with something with this class, and I was like, if we're going to do it, then let's just do it. And so here's today. Last time we talked about we suffer together. When hard times happen, we step up as a family, and we stand with each other, and Remember that Hebrews passage? It's one of my favorite passages. I love the picture. Sometimes it's my turn to walk through the fire, and sometimes it's my turn to walk through somebody else's fire with them. Or the Hebrews 13 version was, some of you got put into prison, and then the Hebrew writer said, you be with them as if in prison with them. We suffer together through misery. But here's the thing. What happens when the suffering is inflicted by our family? I'm not talking about their suffering in my life and my church family comes and stands with me during that time. What happens when my church family is the source of the suffering? That's not a fun conversation to have. And it's very real. I am reluctant to do this. This whole class, I'm reluctant to do this. But I've tried to make this class real with lots of examples so we know what we're talking about here. Does anybody want to carefully share an example of what we're talking about? Jim?
I think it's something we're kind of new in this nation today. Half the people that don't agree with the other half the people that maybe want to harm them in some way. Move back to the American Civil War 100 or so years ago. I mean, people were being attacked by their own people, whichever side that would be on.
Yeah.
So it's something that we as humans are familiar with. In the church, we don't really want to think about that.
Yeah.
It's difficult.
And you read the Civil War in history books, but can you imagine a situation where you're pointing a gun and firing at your own family? And then you take that picture of, in that situation, destructive violence towards your own family, and you put it into a church situation, and you've got this side of the church is firing at this side of the church is firing at this. And I would like to see this. Would you raise your hand, please, if you've ever been in one of those situations where it is the church that is your problem? Not that's walking with you through the problem, but that is your problem. Look around. I think it's going to be a lot of us. Seriously, hold your hand up and take a look around. This is no joke. So, yeah, we can start with what I want to do this morning. Maria?
I guess I'm thinking back to the comment Dave just made earlier, that, suffering can happen because of our church family, but, how we react and where we have our faith and where we handle it is ultimately up to us as individuals, especially, and I can especially say this, having gone through some messy situations like this and having, being able to retrospect and look back and say, okay, there are things that I maybe didn't handle as well as I should have, and it's made me really look into where is my faith? Where is my, yes, we're supposed to love each other in the church and be there for each other and everything else, but ultimately my faith needs to be in the Lord.
Yeah.
And it shouldn't be swayed or how I treat others or handle situations. That should all be based and foundational on God and God's word and what he says and the examples he has given us, not based on other people's actions, what people are doing or not doing.
Right. Yeah, good. Did I see another hand over here? Yeah, Josh.
I think most of the time, I categorize all of those things, but the problem is not the problem is the response to the problem. So oftentimes when we're suffering because of somebody else, and right now we're talking about the church family, instead of addressing it in a godly manner, it's either ignored or highly emotionally charged. So that takes a problem and creates a larger one due to our poor response.
Yeah, I love that. I'm going to write that in my notes. The problem's not the problem is my response to the problem. Because that's what I can control.
Exactly.
Jessica?
Piggybacking off of that,
Mm-hmm.
And then the emotions really, I mean, you can say, oh, we logically need to reason through this. It's emotional too.
Yeah.
It's a betrayal sometimes, or you feel like it's a betrayal. People think they're right on both sides. It's not that everyone is picking the wrong side and carrying that banner just to be obstinate. Not always. It's, they think that they're right and they think that they're helping that family member understand what is right.
Yeah.
And so it becomes a huge emotional battle for everybody.
Mess.
Yeah.
Everyone's dug in. Just like everything in the rest of this class, as we have this conversation, think about what you would do in your own house. And then we're going to bring it into this conversation. Last one, and then we'll push forward here.
One of the problems with what Jessica was just saying is that people can't hurt your feelings unless you care about what their opinion of you is or what they feel.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, well, that's the problem with family, is that I do care. And that's why it hurts more.
That's why it hurts.
Yeah. Yeah. So here's what I'm going to do this morning. And I'm going to start this ball rolling. But once you see what I'm doing, I would gladly have your input before I click my point on the board. So I'll start, and then there's that. So here's the thing that I want to do. When the hurt happens, we have two choices as far as I can see. We can go, and the going is sometimes an option that has to happen. It has to. Sometimes it has to. Sometimes in a marriage, sometimes going has to happen. Not as a first resort, but sometimes it has to happen. And so we can go. But there is one thing that I'd like. I always have this conversation whenever we talk about the going option. Which church in the New Testament would you have wanted to be a part of? And if you think about it for about 40 seconds, you can see what the point is that I'm making. The Bible is written to people about their problems. Which shows us, like, you got all kinds of churches that are just composed of messed up people with lots of problems. And so if you're going because you're looking for perfection, you're not going to find it. But that's one of our options. You can go. And I'm not going to talk about that option in class. What I'm going to talk about is staying. And so you can go or you can grow. And the growing is the list that I'm going to put up here on the board right now. What happens when we stay? Number one. You might want to debate this. Look at Acts chapter 6. In Acts chapter 6, if I talk about a messed up church, probably most of you go straight to Corinth. That was a messed up church. But you don't have to get to Corinth. You can just start at the very beginning at the church in Jerusalem in Acts chapter 6. Think about this in verse 1. Now in these days when the disciples were increasing in number, so stop. Things are moving in the right direction. Like this is how I feel about this passage. This is why I come to this passage. I think of us right now moving in the right direction. And at some point, I don't want to encourage someone to do this, but at some point, somebody's going to be the speed bump. So you're moving in the right direction, and the mindset is, don't mess it up. That's our church in Jerusalem. As the disciples were increasing in number, a complaint by the Hellenists arose against the Hebrews because their widows were being neglected in the daily distribution of food. So look at this. You want to talk about church problems? You've got a showstopper. Things are moving in the right direction, and we have something that puts the brakes on God's work. It's a racism problem. There's racism in the church. One group of people says, ew. The group of people over here, no. You want to talk about problems in the church? And not only is it a racism problem, based on racism, the church is starving some of its members. You don't get food. That's not a little problem. You know what I'm talking about? I can't hardly think of anything in Corinth that's worse than that. That's worse than what we see here. You're going to stop the work. It's motivated by racist reasons, which I'd like to think are taken care of. Let's not do that again. And not only are there, these hostile racist feelings, but based on the racism, we're going to starve some of our people. That's not little stuff.
Not even some of the people, it's the widows.
The most vulnerable among us.
Like, people in the Hellenist group would probably feel pretty upset that you're starving our widows.
Yeah, let's add 4 things to that list. Terrible. This is terrible. So we have a problem in the church. It would have been very easy. It would have been very easy in a situation less than this to pack up your stuff and go down the road and say, I'm done with this. I'm going to go do my own thing down here, where my vulnerable people don't have to starve to death. I could justify that. I could make that decision easily to say, no way, I'm not doing this anymore.
People form cliques, and they would have the haves and the have-nots, and you're talking about starving people, and they applied that to whatever they did. It's servitude, and one clique over another.
Yeah. The Bible's pretty clear on that subject. James especially, treating people with stuff differently from those without stuff because of their stuff, not okay. Okay, so let's keep going here. Verse 2. And the 12 summoned the full number of disciples and said, it's not right that we should give up preaching the word of God to serve tables. Therefore, brothers, I'm going to just put in parentheses the solution to this problem. Figure it out. That's the biblical command. Absolutely don't continue in this nightmare. That's not okay. Not some of the most vulnerable among you are starving to death for racist reasons. How about this? How about we start a group of Jewish churches and Gentile churches, and then everybody will make sure to take care of their own? The apostles' solution is, let's find a solution to this problem. Let's do something about it. And so look, they do. Therefore, in verse 3, brothers, pick out from among you 7 men of good repute, full of the Spirit and wisdom, whom we will appoint for this duty. But we will devote ourselves to prayer and the ministry of the word. One of the things I love about this example is the problem doesn't stop the work. I love that. We're not going to stop doing the thing that we're supposed to be doing to deal with the problem, but we still have to deal with the problem. Verse 5, and what they said pleased the whole gathering, and they chose Stephen. I think this is really clever what they do. You'll notice that most of the names in this list are Hellenist names. So the solution that they came up with was creative and clever to fix the problem. They put their heads together and they said, let's do something that's going to work. And then, this is the end of it in verse 6. They set before them the apostles, they prayed, and they laid their hands on them. Verse 7. And the word of God continued to increase, and the number of disciples multiplied greatly in Jerusalem, and a great many of these priests became obedient to the faith. They stayed, they walked through the fire, they didn't stop the work, they fixed the problem, and on the other side, everybody wins. That's not a snap your fingers and 5 minutes later situation. That's one of those long, suffering, awful, miserable things with lots of sleepless nights to deal with. And I think we can probably understand some of these things. In an everybody wins situation, I think that we can do this. Let me not put this on your shoulders. I do this. Even now. Sometimes there are the difficult folks, and I'll use the phrase addition by subtraction. If somebody is, I've had folks who just like daily make my life miserable. And when they go, my life is better. And so it's easy for me to say addition by subtraction. But I want you to imagine your own kitchen table and the people that you love and your own family, and to think about a scenario where you would say, we're better off without one of those people at the table. Not everybody wins in that situation. Any comments? Did I see a hand? Ryan and then Nick.
I really like the problem solving from within. They didn't go and run to any local authorities. They didn't go and grab their family members that were not Christians. And in the same way, I think that has an application for how we deal with future problems.
Yeah.
It's not for us to rat out people and blast people online. It's not a conversation that my coworkers should ever be privy to have an ear to. They're local problems, they're church problems, and they're not to be on display for other people.
Yeah.
I think about the C.S. Lewis quote where he urges people, we never debate doctrine in front of non-believers. So why would we complain about our problems in front of non-believers?
Yeah. And it's like a practical, like we should know this. Don't go to work and talk about your problems with your wife. Same thing with this family. Nick, did you have one?
This kind of goes along with that same point, which is everybody only won because there was submission to what the solution the apostles came to. Like, if there were members of this congregation that said, we're still upset about this. I know the apostles appointed some people to handle it, but we're not going to submit to them. We're going to do our own thing, or we're going to, continue to make it an issue. It's no. The apostles said this thing. They found a solution. We're all on board and submitting to them and following them through the outcome of this problem.
Yeah.
It's the same thing with our shepherds. There's a problem here, and the shepherds come to a solution to say, this is how we're going to move forward. It's our job as the sheep to say, all right, we submit to you, and we're going to follow you through that.
Yeah. And so often you can look at church problems and family problems. So often there's a bowing of the back where a person says, I'm going to do what I want to do and I don't care. Well, now we have a problem. And the solution is, how can we, that's going to be my thing. And I look at so many church problems and the ones that I've been involved in and the ones that I read about in history books, and I think, this is a generation of people who invented and increased the ability of computers. And you're trying to tell me that we can't figure this out? Like, we can't find an answer to this problem? Some way we can't find... It's hard for me to imagine that if you have a room full of people who want to solve the problem, that we can't find a solution to the problem.
If you're a family, you've got 4 kids, the oldest one becomes rebellious. You've got to deal with it. You have no choice. You've got to deal with it. If you allow him to set the example for the younger ones, you're in big trouble.
Yeah.
Same thing happens in the church. If you've got a rebellious Christian, he will not, Matthew 18, whatever, you talk to him individually, that doesn't work. Another 2 or 3, that doesn't work. The church, it doesn't submit. You've got to deal with it.
Yeah.
He's going to create a division in the Lord's congregation. Discipline is necessary.
Yeah. Yeah, and hopefully the discipline does what it's intended to do.
That's what it's.
Yeah, hopefully. Okay, I'm going to push forward here. Let me make sure I didn't skip anything that I wanted to say. Oh, I want to read this to you. Keith Stoneheart was on one of Jake and Nick's podcasts. And Keith put something, I don't have a date. Keith put something on somewhere on the internet, and I saved it and I stuck it on this point. No one leaves the church without breaking someone else's heart. No one leaves a congregation without breaking someone else's heart. It's this way because no one leaves a family without breaking someone else's heart. When we base our church model from a business model, then it's just business and it's not personal. When we base our church model from a family model, then it's always personal and never business. Jesus wanted a family, not customers. Whatever it is, work it out. Make it personal. Okay, number 2. What happens when we stay? We have an opportunity to be refined by fire. That's not just me doing some sort of motivational speech that I read in a Dale Carnegie book. This is actually in the Bible. And even though I'm a little bit, my stomach turns over just a little bit here because I'm thinking, okay, I can skip some of these passages and we can get through with this class today. I'm kind of afraid that we're going to have to extend this class into 2 classes, which is the last thing that I want to do. But I also don't want to skip material in this conversation, so be it. Look at James chapter 1. I want to read a handful of passages here on this one. Would somebody please read for us James chapter 1 and verses 2 through 4 with special emphasis on the first 4 words.
Consider it all joy, my brethren, when you encounter various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance. And let endurance have its perfect result, so that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing.
Do you remember? No, that's good, thanks. Remember when Ed taught James last quarter? And we spent an entire class where he said, okay, we know this part, that various trials lead to the testing of our faith and produce steadfastness, and let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect, complete, lacking in nothing. We talked about that. And then Ed stopped and said, we're going to have a whole nother class about count it all joy. What? Who's looking forward to that? Who's going to step into that situation where, I mean, just think about it. Just think about the situation that's on your mind when you raised your hand and you went through that church family nightmare that created way more misery and stress in your life than anything that ever happened at work in the past. And James says, count it joy when this happens, because it produces something. It leads to something.
I think about the example that we just did with the church in Jerusalem, and they had a what we would consider a big problem, right? People were being starved, but that's nothing compared to the famine that's going to come. I mean, we know that this church is going to be starving collectively. So you had a difficulty passing out food before. Well, thank goodness you had that figured out, because now we're going to be sending apostles all over the Mediterranean gathering money for you, and you don't know how to deal with that. How's that distribution going to go?
Yeah, what a great example. That needs to go in my notes too. This thing that we talked about as a major speed bump, in hindsight, was not a major speed bump compared to what it was preparing them for. Wow, what a great point. That's awesome. I feel like dwelling on that. That's a good point, because that's the thing. When you look back at your own church suffering, the suffering that came from your family, if you made it through it in a way that everybody wins on the other side, with hindsight you can say, now I'm a better person because of it. I can. That point does that for me. I learned some things that I would not have learned otherwise and grew. Yeah, that's good. I can't move on past that. That's good. Maria?
When you think about, I guess, like what we read in the scriptures and how the Christians here suffered, all the torture and just the persecution, and that's even going on disrespectful in any stretch or to even really discount. But if you compare that to like some of what we're discussing here, some of the situations that go on where there's disagreements in the church, it almost seems really, and it seems like it's more, a lot of times it's personalities.
Yeah.
People just not getting along for whatever reason. It seems really, again, I'm not trying to be disrespectful, but I'm gonna say it seems very petty.
Yeah. Not always.
I don't have to worry about coming to church and is somebody gonna firebomb this church and seal the doors to where we can't even escape.
Yeah.
Or is somebody gonna kill me on the way home? Or, or kill my beautiful nieces on the way home because they're Christians.
Yeah.
I mean, and so again, I don't mean it to be disrespectful, but at the same time, when I think about stuff like that, it really puts in perspective, and it's really very sobering in the sense that, maybe I need to step it up, and even though I may not agree with something, unless it was, of course, like a doctrine matter, like someone saying, well, Jesus isn't Lord, and Jesus is our Savior, that's a whole different, I'm not talking about stuff like that.
Right. So
I
let's
mean,
do this,
I have
though.
to step up and say,
Let's do this, though, on this one. I think that,
you know
yes.
what I'm trying to say?
Yeah. So on that one, a couple thoughts on that one. It's not always petty. Often it is, but not always. But I would say this, it's the same thing that Dick told me. Becky's dad is over here. Dick told me this with my kids. It's one of his rules with kids. When one of your kids has their first heartbreak and they come home and they're suffering and you want to laugh at them because it's like, this is not that big of a deal. It is that big of a deal to them. Their heart is broken and they're suffering. And so I would not ever minimize someone's suffering no matter what the comparison is to other thing. Suffering is suffering. Look at this. 1 Peter chapter 1 starting in verse 6. Here's another one just to add to this list. In this you rejoice. Boy, it's like God is going to say this several times to really make it hard. In this you rejoice, though now for a little while, if necessary, you have been grieved by various trials, so that the tested genuineness of your faith, more precious than gold that perishes, though it is tested by fire, may be found to result in praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ. And so you read that in the light of this, and you think, okay, now I'm in the storm. And when you're in the storm, it would kind of be like a police comparison sort of thing. You don't have a shooting situation every single day. But when you're in the shooting situation, nothing else matters. You have to train for the tunnel vision scenario. And here's the problem, but you still have to be aware of the bigger picture. And so here's one thing that I would hope for our takeaway. The next time your misery and your suffering happens, take 3 deep breaths, and before you react, say to yourself, can this ultimately be good for me? It's possible. It's hard to see in the moment. That's the thing. That's why we prepare now. I would say for myself, I would be tempted to use the word impossible to see in the moment. But what if we could get our heads straight now? And we could say, all right, I'm ready. And when my time comes to say, I'm going to try and learn from this and grow from this and not fall apart and fail. I've got another one for you here. It's not from the Bible. This is from a book that's not in the Bible. This is one of those books that's in the Catholic Bible, but not in our Bibles. And it should not be in our Bible. I'm not saying it should be. But I like the way that it's worded, and I want to share this with you. There's a book called Ecclesiasticus. Not Ecclesiastes, Ecclesiasticus. And this is from chapter 2. My child, when you come to serve the Lord, prepare yourself for testing. Set your heart right and be steadfast, and do not be impetuous in time of calamity. Cling to him and do not depart, so that your last days may be prosperous. So cling to him, don't fail, because there's a reward at the end of that road. Accept whatever befalls you, and in times of humiliation be patient. For gold is tested by fire, and those found acceptable in the furnace of humiliation. Who wants to do that? But it produces something. Trust in him and he will help you. Make your ways straight and hope in him. You who fear the Lord, wait for his mercy, do not stray, or else you may fall. That's a neat quote about suffering. Anything you want to say about having the opportunity? I feel ridiculous saying the word. You have to know that I feel like a joker standing up here saying it, but it's true. We have the opportunity to be tested and refined by fire.
I think sometimes when these things happen, I get a moment of thinking, oh, there must be something wrong, or like that there's a glitch in God's plan or something, but I think it's helpful for me to remember the book of Ephesians, because it teaches how like God intended the church to be made up of all kinds of different people from different backgrounds, and he intended us all to come to this unity. And when we're faced with someone who's thinking opposite of us or demanding us to forgive them, or we're put in a situation to forgive them, then we have an opportunity to be like God. And we're kind of forced to be, to make the relationship work, you have to forgive them. And to make the relationship work, you have to be loving, and you have to exhibit God's characteristics, and to exhibit it all the way through your heart. And it's similar in a marriage relationship.
Yeah.
To make that relationship work, you have to put on God's characteristics.
Yeah.
And in some ways, it helps me appreciate those times, because not everyone in the church is married, and not everyone maybe has that maturity, that way to mature. But through relationships with each other, and more importantly through difficult relationships, you do, and that's how we all come to that image of him.
Yeah. So, Sarah, look at the number 4. Let's do that one next. What does this do for us? What happens when we stay? We have an opportunity to be more like God and Jesus. And I've only got 5 minutes, so we'll do this one next time, because I want to make sure and go through the list. But here's my list. In what ways can we be like God and Jesus? I think you mentioned most of them. Forgiveness is one of his qualities. I'll not make you the bad guy. When I do something to you and you forgive me freely, you have an opportunity to be like God in that. Think of that situation. And who wants to do that? Like, who wants to offer your son? But that's what he did. And we have opportunities to be like him when we have an opportunity to forgive. Sacrifice, number 2 on the list. We have an opportunity to sacrifice in the way that both God and Jesus sacrifice. Reconciliation, we'll read 2 Corinthians 5, and how both God through Jesus and Paul in his work with the Corinthians was working to reconcile people together. When we reconcile, we have an opportunity to be like God, to demonstrate God's characteristics. We're going to do this. Romans 3, verses 21 to 26. And here's the list that you can read about what God did in those passages. Verse 23 says, all have sinned. Yes, even me. When I'm angry at you because of something that you did to me, I can probably stop and think about how I've done something to somebody else and made them angry at me 100-fold. And so to have the opportunity to realize all have sinned. Verse 24 talks about justification by grace. Obviously, I cannot do what Jesus did, but I can strive to make you right as a gift in the way that God has done that for me. Redemption, to purchase another at personal cost. Propitiation, this is a definition. Propitiation is essentially a process by which one does a favor to a person in order to make him or her favorably disposed. So you're going to do me a favor to make me right. We can do that. That's what God has done for us. We can do that for each other. In verse 25, in his divine forbearance, he passed over former sins. I can do that with you. I can say, I'm not going to hold every single thing that you've ever done in your life over your head forever. I'm going to pass over. God is both just and the justifier. Here's my last sentence on that. This is the 3-minute version. We'll look at these verses next time. When the spiritual direction of God's family was completely messed up, God's response was to sacrifice himself for the eternal well-being of the whole. When things go wrong in the spiritual family today, all too often the response is to evaluate my own personal feelings and needs and leave for somewhere else that can meet those needs in a more satisfactory way. Or I can be like God. So we're going to talk about this one next time. Suffering brings people together. Think about your examples on that one. I've got a lot of good examples for that one. We can be more like God. And then I want to talk about this one too. When I stay and work through it, and hopefully it works out, I'm able to send a message. What's the message that I send? And then the alternative of that, whenever I'm not willing to work through it and I go, what message am I sending? Think about those questions.